Over 50 years since the death of Brian Jones, and Anna Wallin still mourns him. She dreams of Brian at the bottom of the swimming pool. She attempts to pull him out, but he sinks further down. After Brian's death, Anna became something of a celebrity. Brian's girlfriend, the woman who was with him the night he died. In London, she was the talk of the town. Naively, she believed the vultures posing as friends were genuinely concerned for her. They weren't. She later came to realise the only thing they had in common were the drugs they were taking. At this time, Anna wrote a letter to Mick Jagger accusing him of not caring enough about Brian's death. He never replied. One night she saw him in a club. The two looked at each other, but Mick didn't recognise Anna. They had never been properly introduced. The only thing she could think when she saw him was how unfair it was that he was alive and Brian wasn't. She never approached him and regretted that decision for decades afterwards. One day at the Stones' offices, Anna bumped into Brian's dad, Lewis. She broke down and sobbed, stating, "I miss Brian so badly. I still can't accept he's gone." Lewis replied, "I missed you at the funeral. I expected you to be there when Brian was put to rest." Anna replied tearfully, "I know, I wanted to, but I couldn't." Anna went on to talk about how after Brian's death she went to Sweden. She'd only just returned to London and was planning a trip to Cotchford Farm to pick up some of her belongings. Lewis then stated, "I'm so sorry to tell you, but there's nothing left in the house. Everything's gone. Brian's clothes, albums, tapes, musical instruments. That was one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. I was hoping you could tell me what happened to Brian's belongings." Lewis went on to say when he arrived at Cotchford Farm, the house was completely empty. Not a thing left, not even the sheets. It has been suspected Tom Keelock took the possessions in hopes of selling them at a later date. As their conversation came to an end, Lewis handed Anna a picture of Brian when he was 5 years old, stating, "Nobody can take our memories away from us." Over the next few months, Anna stayed in London renting a small apartment. Every night she fell asleep with one of Brian's shirts. In May 1970, Anna decided to return one last time to Cotchford Farm. She couldn't face going alone, so a friend joined her. When she approached the house, she felt a sense of dread and immediately regretted coming. When Brian lived there, the house was full of life, the sounds of barking dogs, birds singing, televisions blaring, all now gone. It was eerily quiet. A wave of sadness overcame her when she approached the pool. The water was dirty and full of leaves. When Brian was alive, he tended to it constantly. The pool was his pride and joy. He lived for it, and he died in it. All Anna could think was, had Brian been alive, he'd be shocked by the condition it was in. Instinctual thoughts began to take over Anna as she walked around the property. She expected to see her dogs running up to greet her, barking, but was met with silence. Then she thought back to the first time she met Brian Jones. In 1965, Anna was visiting London with a friend, and one night they attended a rock concert. The Rolling Stones were headlining. Allegedly, when their set finished, Mick Jagger jumped off stage and grabbed Anna. She told him she wasn't interested, but he ignored her and began to drag her to the exit. Anna shoved him away and Mick left. Of the members of the group, she'd only been taken with Brian. Every so often she saw him in Bond Street or in a nightclub, but the two never spoke. Over the years, Anna followed his career in the newspapers. She read about his relationship with Anita Pallenberg, and it made her jealous and miserable. Over the next 4 years, she saw Brian occasionally and exchanged small talk, but that was it. In 1969, Anita Pallenberg had left Brian for Keith Richards. Around this time, Anna saw him at a party she attended, and after talking they met up several more times and began a relationship. Brian had recently bought Cotchford Farm, and it didn't take Anna long to move in. She fell in love with the house, the statues of Winnie the Pooh, Eeyore and Tigger in the garden. Brian talked about moving the statue of Christopher Robin into the kitchen, but he wouldn't live long enough to see it through. As much as she loved the house, no one loved it more than Brian. When away, he talked about Cotchford Farm constantly. To him, it was the most beautiful place in the world. John Lennon once visited and the two had played together. In the kitchen stood a pine table Brian was especially proud of. Neither of them washed their clothes themselves, they always paid to have it done, though they'd often find some would be stolen in the process. Brian filled the house with a mixture of antiques and souvenirs from Morocco. He talked about his family often, his detachment from the Stones, and his guilt for not seeing his children. Neither of the pair could cook, but neither wanted to leave Cotchford Farm either. So, through trial and error, Anna began learning how to prepare meals. Brian's favourite meal was steak, potatoes and vegetables with a glass of milk. Anna made him something similar most days and cooked him a fried breakfast each morning. For the housework, Brian hired a cleaner and a gardener to maintain the grounds. Music was constantly playing. Brian fell asleep and woke up to it. He would often nod off while Bob Dylan's Nashville Skyline was playing. The week Anna moved in, she was introduced to Frank Thorogood. He was doing building work on the house. Frank was married and lived with his wife but stayed at Cotchford Farm on the weekdays. He and Brian became friends and he would join them for dinner or drinks each night. This annoyed Anna and she told Brian it wasn't necessary to invite Frank to dinner every night. Brian replied, "I know, but I've treated him to dinner every night since he came to work here. I can't ask him to cook his own dinner now." Brian often spent his time sunbathing or in the pool. Ironically, he would warn Anna of the dangers of swimming alone. He seldom swam alone, always requesting someone to keep an eye on him. The one time he was left alone proved to be fatal. At night, the floodlights lit up the pool and light from the house shone onto the garden. Brian would state it looked like an advertising poster for Hollywood, but in his words it was much more beautiful here, much more beautiful. Brian was somebody who was ruled by impulse. He drank every day, and any idea he liked the sound of he'd go with before later changing his mind. He booked trips to Morocco and then decided against it. Anna lost count of how many hours she spent packing and then unpacking suitcases. The daily routine at Cotchford Farm went as follows: breakfast, a walk around the garden, lunch, a trip out in the car, sunbathing by the pool, dinner, and at night, TV and drinks. Brian knew someone in London who sent him all the latest singles and albums. Anna had learnt to play piano as a child along with several instruments, and the two often played together in the music room. At this time, Brian began messing around with different sounds and ideas for a single, but nothing was ever recorded and no lyrics were ever written. When the couple would leave the farm, it would be for drives around the countryside and to the nearby village. Brian was a terrible driver. He always had trouble concentrating behind the wheel. One time he narrowly escaped a crash when he didn't see a car that had right of way. The incident shook him up and he talked about it for the rest of the day. He thought himself a worthless driver and said he shouldn't be allowed to have a license. Brian found it hard to sleep that night, worrying about what could have happened. Ironically, the next day Keith Richards was driving with Anita Pallenberg in the passenger seat. He crashed the car, taking a corner at 70 miles per hour. Despite being thrown from the vehicle, he walked away uninjured. Anita, who was pregnant at the time, broke her collarbone. At this time, Brian was taking a pill called Mandrax, also known as Quaaludes. He'd been prescribed the drug by his doctor to help him sleep. He was also taking Valium, which was also on prescription. Brian wasn't going to risk doing anything illegal. He lived in fear the police would bust him again if he did. The police had busted him twice before. The second time he swore was a setup. One of the worst periods of his life had been when he was arrested for drug possession, and he swore he'd never put himself through that again. Instead, his drug of choice was alcohol, either whiskey or white wine, normally Blue Nun, which was popular at the time. At the farm, Brian would talk about his relationship with Anita Pallenberg. He told Anna their relationship was a constant seesaw of fights and drugs. He went on to say how controlling she was and wouldn't be surprised if she had magic powers. He stated, "Perhaps she's a witch, a real witch." Brian also noted he was happy he never got addicted to heroin like Keith and Anita have. Brian at this time had put on weight and contacted his doctor for some slimming tablets. He was prescribed Durafet, also known as Black Bombers. Anna too used Durafet as well as Quaaludes, but kept it a secret. Brian found the drugs one day and went berserk. He flushed them down the toilet, and Anna left the house in a huff. She stayed away for a while, got prescribed more tablets, then eventually returned to Cotchford Farm. The incident was forgotten about, and that was that. The Rolling Stones were having problems at this time. Nothing had been the same since Anita had left Brian for Keith. Originally, Brian had formed the group. It was his band. Slowly, he lost control. Mick and Keith began writing songs together and never involved Brian. This made him feel excluded, and he created a role for himself by adding experimental instruments. They took the songs to another level and made Brian as important as Mick or Keith. When Mick and Keith turned down some of his additions, it hurt him deeply. He felt frozen out and lonely. While at Cotchford Farm, recording sessions were booked with the Rolling Stones, and a driver was sent to pick up Brian each morning and drive him to London. He made excuses each day and didn't show up. Brian had already left the Stones in his mind. He felt playing with Keith again would never be the same. John Lennon visited the farm around that time, played guitar with Brian, and as he was leaving told Anna, "Take care of Brian, try to support him and cheer him up." Not long after, the Stones paid Brian a visit and fired him from the band. Afterwards, Brian obtained some cocaine, according to Anna, from Keith, according to other sources, from books he'd hidden drugs in through the house. He snorted cocaine and drank through the day and became very sick at night. After the firing, Brian's departure from the band was made official. The press surrounded Cotchford Farm awaiting Brian's response. He refused to give interviews and just made a statement. In the following days, his mood was ever changing, from joy to despair. One night while Frank, Brian and Anna were eating at dinner, Brian grabbed a napkin and began writing on it. He handed it over to Frank, whispering, and Frank wrote on it too. Brian then handed Anna the napkin, which read, "Anna, will you marry me? Brian Jones, witnessed by Frank Thorogood." Anna felt embarrassed and laughed before tearing up the napkin. It didn't offend Brian, but Anna regretted it for years afterwards. One day after dinner, the phone rang and Anna answered. It was her friend from London, and the two spoke in Swedish while Brian cleared the table. All of a sudden, Brian ran towards Anna, tackling her to the floor. Anna screamed, "What the hell are you doing?" And at that moment, a beam fell from the ceiling, crashing to the floor. Had Brian not pushed her out the way, it would have fallen directly on her head. The beam lay with one end resting on the table and the other on the floor. The beam had been installed by workmen Frank Thorogood had hired. Brian inspected some of the other beams and later went berserk at Frank. He shouted, "You call yourself a builder? You're no better than an apprentice." Frank apologised before Brian ranted more. Brian stormed off and later felt bad about scolding Frank. He stated, "He's 44 and has a boring life." Workmen had returned at this point and were hammering away in the kitchen. After the beam was refitted, Brian checked it over and everything appeared fine. Later that night, Frank stayed away from the house, not appearing for dinner or drinks. Brian wondered if he'd been too aggressive. It was always his instinct to apologise when he'd upset somebody. Brian phoned Keith that night and told him about the incident. According to Anna, Keith said, "You should never have let him in the house in the first place. Though how the hell is a builder going to do work on your property if you don't let him in the door?" At this time, a nurse named Janet, who apparently had been sent to the house to watch over Brian, appeared. Frank arrived back at the property and he and Brian drank together. After 7 whiskies or brandies, depending on whose testimony you believe, Brian wobbled along the diving board and went for a swim. Frank joined to follow his rule of never swim alone, and Anna accompanied them. Anna was called away by a phone call while Janet was in the house. Frank left the pool and Brian fell unconscious and drowned. Janet headed out to the pool and saw Brian at the bottom. She called for help and Anna dove in. The terror she felt when she saw him at the bottom stays with her till this day. She pulled Brian to the surface and Frank pulled him out. Anna attempted to resuscitate him, and according to her, Brian still had a pulse and squeezed her hand. The ambulance arrived and he was declared dead on arrival. For many years, Anna blamed herself for the tragedy. Then she blamed Frank. She'd believed he'd killed Brian. Maybe it gave her some comfort, taking the blame away from herself. In reality, Brian was only to blame. He was intoxicated and he chose to go swimming. He took many risks in his life. Some favoured him. This one killed him. When an autopsy was done on Brian, his heart was found to be enlarged and his liver diseased from alcoholism. The question is, had he not drowned, how much longer would he have lived? Brian lived a life of excess, and many who do often fall back on the cliche response, "What about Keith Richards? He's still alive." Unfortunately, most people don't have Keith Richards' seemingly inhuman resistance to drugs and alcohol. Brian Jones definitely didn't.